The arena floor was slick with alien blood, and Marcus Chen stood in the center of it all, his chest heaving as he lowered his plasma rifle. Around him lay the scattered remains of what had once been the most feared gladiatorial team in the Vorthak Empire's history. The crowd of 100,000 aliens from across the galaxy fell into stunned silence as the lone human warrior turned slowly, his dark eyes scanning the royal viewing box where Emperor Vorthak himself sat frozen in disbelief. Marcus had volunteered for this death match knowing full well that humans were considered the weakest species in the known galaxy. Earth had been conquered 3 years ago, its people scattered across the Empire as slaves, laborers, and entertainment. But Marcus had been different. He had been a Marine before the invasion, and even as a slave, he had never stopped being a warrior. The Emperor's massive form shifted on his crystalline throne. Vorthak stood 12 feet tall, his chitinous exoskeleton gleaming purple-black under the arena lights. His 4 arms gestured dismissively as his translator device crackled to life. Impossible! The human must have cheated. No inferior species could defeat my champions. But the arena's sensors told a different story. Marcus had fought with nothing but standard weapons and his own tactical brilliance. He had turned the Zephyrian team's speed against them, used the Kramach warrior's size as a disadvantage, and exploited every weakness with the calculating precision that had made humans feared as guerrilla fighters during the brief war. "The rules were clear, Your Imperial Majesty," announced the arena master, a nervous Quellian whose tentacles writhed with anxiety. "The human fought within all parameters. He has won the right to claim any reward within the Empire's power to grant." The Emperor's mandibles clicked in frustrated anger. He had designed this challenge to be impossible, expecting the human to provide amusing entertainment before dying horribly. The reward had been offered as a cruel joke, never expecting anyone to actually claim it. Now, by the ancient laws that held his empire together, he was bound to honor his word. Marcus stepped forward, his combat armor scarred but intact. He had spent months planning for this moment, studying every aspect of Vorthak law and custom. He knew exactly what he was going to ask for, and it would shake the foundations of everything the Empire believed about species hierarchy. "I claim my reward," Marcus said, his voice carrying clearly across the silent arena. "Name it human," Vorthak snarled, his 4 arms clenching into fists. "Wealth, territory, a quick death instead of the slow one I will give you." Marcus smiled, and something in that expression made several alien nobles shift uncomfortably in their seats. "I claim Princess Lyrelei of House Nethes as my bondmate, according to the ancient law of conquest reward." The silence that followed was absolute. In the royal box, a figure in the shadows stirred slightly, but made no sound. Princess Lyrelei had been forgotten by almost everyone present, which was exactly what Marcus had counted on. Emperor Vorthak's roar of rage shook the arena. "You dare claim one of royal blood, a princess of the Empire?" "The law is clear," Marcus replied calmly. "Any reward within the Empire's power to grant. Princess Lyrelei is unwed, making her available for political alliance through bond mating. As the victor of your challenge, I claim that right." The Emperor's eyes burned with fury, but around him, his advisors were frantically consulting their legal databases. The ancient laws were indeed clear, and breaking them would undermine the legal foundation that held the diverse empire together. Several of the watching alien nobles were already calculating how they might use this precedent to their own advantage. In the shadows of the royal box, Princess Lyrelei finally stepped forward into the light. The crowd gasped as they got their first clear look at her in years. She was Nethesian, a species known for their ethereal beauty and powerful psychic abilities. Her skin held an opalescent quality that shifted from pale blue to silver in the arena lights, and her long white hair moved as if underwater despite the still air. But what caught Marcus's attention were her eyes, ancient beyond her years, and holding a depth of intelligence that he recognized as formidable. What the crowd saw, however, was what they had always seen when they bothered to look at her at all. Princess Lyrelei was small for her species, barely 5.5 feet tall in a race of 7-foot giants. Her psychic abilities, while present, were considered weak compared to her relatives. She had been overlooked, dismissed, and ignored by court society for so long that most had forgotten she existed. But Marcus had done his research. He knew that Princess Lyrelei had spent her isolation studying military history, xenobiology, and imperial law. He knew that her supposedly weak psychic abilities were actually highly specialized. She could read the true intentions and emotions of others with startling accuracy. Most importantly, he knew that she had been watching the gladiatorial matches for months, studying him as carefully as he had been studying the Empire's legal codes. "This is preposterous," snarled Prince Zelthar, Lyrale's cousin and heir to the Nethisian throne. "She is of royal blood. She cannot be given to a slave." "I am no longer a slave," Marcus replied, his voice carrying the authority of absolute conviction. "By right of conquest in honorable combat, I have earned my freedom and the right to claim reward. The law recognizes no distinction of species in matters of conquest law." The Emperor's massive form trembled with suppressed rage. To refuse would be to break the sacred laws that had held his empire together for millennia. But to allow a human, a member of what his empire considered the lowest species, to bond with royalty would be an unprecedented challenge to the entire social order. Princess Lyrale spoke for the first time, her voice clear and carrying despite its soft tone. "I accept the bond claim." The arena erupted into chaos. Alien nobles shouted in outrage, the crowd roared with confusion and excitement, and Emperor Vorthak's advisors argued frantically among themselves. But Marcus was watching only Lyrale, and in her ancient eyes he saw something that made his warrior's heart skip a beat: calculation, intelligence, and perhaps most dangerously of all, ambition. She had not accepted his claim out of resignation or duty. She had accepted it because she saw an opportunity that no one else in the Empire could imagine. As the chaos swirled around them, Marcus realized that he had just set in motion events that would either free humanity or destroy them all. He had chosen Princess Lyrale not just because she was overlooked, but because his research had revealed what everyone else had missed. She was perhaps the most dangerous mind in the entire Vorthak Empire. And now, by the laws of bond mating, they would be allies. The Emperor finally raised all four of his arms, and the arena fell silent. His voice carried the weight of absolute authority as he spoke through gritted mandibles. "The law will be observed. But know this, human, you have claimed more than you bargained for. Princess Lyrale of House Nethys is yours by right of conquest. But the bond mating ceremony will follow all traditional protocols, and should you fail any aspect of the ritual challenges." The Emperor's smile was filled with razor-sharp teeth. "Let us simply say that the Empire has many ways to honor the letter of the law while ensuring its spirit is maintained." Marcus nodded grimly. He had expected this. The bond mating ceremony would involve ritual challenges designed to prove the worthiness of both parties. For a human attempting to bond with alien royalty, those challenges would undoubtedly be designed to be impossible. But as he looked up at Princess Lyrale, he saw her give him the slightest of nods. In that tiny gesture, he read volumes. She had a plan, and somehow she had already begun to put it into motion. The arena began to empty as the stunned crowd filed out, but Marcus remained standing in the center of the blood-stained floor. Guards would come for him soon, to prepare him for the traditional pre-bonding isolation period. But for now, he allowed himself a moment to process what he had just accomplished. Phase 1 was complete. He had successfully claimed the most overlooked member of the imperial royal family, gaining access to resources and legal protections that no human in the Empire had ever possessed. But the real challenge was just beginning. As the guards finally arrived to escort him away, Marcus caught one last glimpse of Princess Lyrale in the royal box. She was speaking quietly to a small group of alien nobles who had approached her, and something about their body language told him that his bondmate was already working angles he couldn't even perceive yet. The human warrior had chosen the overlooked alien princess as his reward. But as he was led away to prepare for the trials ahead, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that perhaps she had chosen him just as deliberately. The game was far from over. In many ways, it was just beginning. In the depths of the imperial palace, as news of the unprecedented bonding spread through the court like wildfire, old alliances began to shift and new possibilities emerged from the shadows. The empire that had conquered Earth with such devastating efficiency was about to learn that humans, when properly motivated and strategically positioned, could be far more dangerous as allies than they had ever been as enemies. And Princess Lyrale of House Nethys, the forgotten royal who had spent years being dismissed and ignored, finally began to smile as her true plans started to unfold. The isolation chamber beneath the imperial palace was designed to break spirits before the bond mating ceremony even began. Marcus had been confined there for 7 standard days, with only minimal food and water, while alien priests prepared the ritual challenges that would determine whether his claim was valid. The chamber was carved from black stone that seemed to absorb light, and the only illumination came from sickly green crystals that hummed with uncomfortable energy. But Marcus was not broken, he was planning. On the third day, food had arrived with a message hidden inside a protein brick. Written in Earth Standard English using a technique that would only be visible to human eyes was a single line. The weak princess sends greetings to her future bondmate. The message told Marcus everything he needed to know. Princess Lyrelei had not only anticipated his imprisonment, but had managed to infiltrate the palace staff delivering his food. More importantly, she was already playing the role of the weak, submissive royal, allowing others to underestimate her while she maneuvered behind the scenes. The second message came on the fifth day, again hidden in his meager rations. 3 challenges await: physical combat, intellectual discourse, and spiritual bonding. The first 2 are designed for you to fail. The third is our opportunity. Marcus spent the remaining days of his isolation preparing mentally for what was to come. The physical combat would likely pit him against multiple opponents in succession, testing his endurance rather than his tactical skill. The intellectual discourse would be conducted in ancient Vorthak philosophical frameworks that no human had ever been taught. Both were meant to be impossible for him to win. But the spiritual bonding ceremony was different. It was an ancient ritual that supposedly allowed the deepest thoughts and intentions of both parties to be examined by the Empire's psychic judges. If Lyrelei was as skilled as Marcus suspected, this would be their chance to communicate directly and coordinate their true plans without any outside interference. When the guards finally came to escort him to the ceremonial arena, Marcus was ready. The arena had been transformed for the occasion. Gone were the blood-stained sands of gladiatorial combat, replaced by 3 distinct ceremonial spaces. The first was a raised platform surrounded by weapons from every species in the Empire. The second was a circular amphitheater with floating hollow displays showing the great philosophical texts of Vorthak civilization. The third was a simple dais surrounded by crystalline structures that hummed with psychic energy. The audience was even more impressive than it had been for his gladiatorial victory. Representatives from every major species in the Empire had come to witness what they assumed would be the humiliation and death of the presumptuous human warrior. Emperor Vorthak sat on his throne with obvious satisfaction, while Prince Zelthar watched with barely concealed anticipation of Marcus's failure. Princess Lyrelei entered the arena from the opposite side, and Marcus had to suppress his surprise at her transformation. Gone was the ethereal beauty he had glimpsed in the royal box. She now appeared exactly as her reputation suggested: small, weak, and unremarkable. Her opalescent skin had been dulled with cosmetics, her hair hung limp and lifeless, and she moved with the hesitant steps of someone unsure of their place in the world. But when their eyes met across the arena, Marcus saw the truth. This was all performance, and she was a master actress playing the role that had kept her alive and unnoticed in a court full of ambitious psychic predators. "Let the first trial begin," announced the High Arbiter, a massive Vorthak priest whose voice echoed with ceremonial authority. "Marcus Chen of Earth will face the trial of physical supremacy to prove his worthiness to bond with royal blood." As Marcus had expected, the challenge was designed to be impossible. He faced wave after wave of opponents, each one fresh while he grew increasingly exhausted. First came a team of 4 Zephyrian speed fighters, their movements so fast they were barely visible. Then a pair of Kramach heavy warriors whose armor was nearly impenetrable. Finally, a single Nethisian psychic warrior whose mental attacks left Marcus reeling. But Marcus had not survived 3 years of slavery by fighting fair. As the Nethisian warrior prepared a final psychic assault that should have left him catatonic, Marcus did something no one expected. He collapsed, apparently defeated, but positioned himself near a discarded Zephyrian energy blade. When the psychic warrior approached to claim victory, Marcus struck with the desperate speed of someone who had nothing left to lose. The blade found the one weak point in Nethisian anatomy that he had learned about during his research, a nerve cluster at the base of their neck that, when severed, caused instant unconsciousness without permanent damage. The crowd gasped as the mighty psychic warrior fell, and Marcus stood swaying over his defeated opponents. He had won, but just barely, and everyone could see that he was operating on pure willpower and adrenaline. "The human warrior has passed the trial of physical supremacy," the High Arbiter announced with obvious reluctance. Let the trial of intellectual discourse begin. This challenge was conducted in the amphitheater, where Marcus was expected to debate the finer points of Vorthak imperial philosophy with three of the Empire's greatest scholars. The topics ranged from the metaphysical foundations of species hierarchy to the ethical implications of conquest law, and all were conducted in philosophical frameworks that assumed human intellectual inferiority as a basic premise. Marcus knew he could not win this challenge through superior knowledge. He simply hadn't had access to the centuries of scholarship these aliens had mastered. Instead, he decided to change the game entirely. "Honored scholars," he said, his voice carrying the respect due to genuine learning while maintaining his dignity as a warrior. "I cannot match your mastery of Vorthak philosophical tradition, but perhaps that is exactly why this trial is necessary." The lead scholar, an ancient Quellian whose tentacles were covered in ceremonial rings denoting academic achievement, gestured impatiently. "Explain yourself, human." "The purpose of bond mating between species is to strengthen the Empire through the combination of different strengths," Marcus replied, drawing on everything he had learned about imperial law and custom. "If I could simply recite your philosophical traditions back to you, what value would the bonding have? My worth lies not in mimicking your thoughts, but in offering perspectives you have never considered." What followed was not a traditional philosophical debate, but something entirely new in imperial history. Marcus shared human perspectives on leadership, tactical thinking, and social organization that were completely alien to Vorthak thought. He spoke of concepts like individual initiative, democratic decision-making, and the strategic value of species diversity that challenged the basic assumptions underlying the Empire's hierarchical structure. The scholars found themselves drawn into genuine intellectual exchange, debating ideas they had never encountered. By the end of the trial, they were no longer testing Marcus's knowledge of their traditions, but exploring entirely new philosophical territories that his human perspective had opened up. "Unprecedented," muttered the lead scholar as the trial concluded. "The human has not demonstrated mastery of our traditions, but has instead forced us to examine our traditions from entirely new angles. This is intellectually stimulating." Emperor Vorthak's expression grew increasingly dark as the scholars debated among themselves before reaching their verdict. "The human warrior has passed the trial of intellectual discourse," the lead scholar announced. "His contribution to imperial philosophical development has been significant." 2 trials down, 1 to go. But as Marcus was escorted to the final ceremonial space, he could see that the Emperor was no longer confident in the outcome. The trials that were supposed to humiliate the presumptuous human had instead demonstrated capabilities that no one had expected. The trial of spiritual bonding was unlike anything Marcus had ever experienced. He and Princess Lyrelei were positioned on opposite sides of the psychic amplification crystals, while 3 of the Empire's most powerful psychic judges prepared to examine their deepest thoughts and intentions. "Let the mind link begin," intoned the high psychic judge, an ethereal being whose species Marcus didn't recognize. "The true nature of both souls will be revealed, and the compatibility of their spiritual essences will be tested." As the crystals activated, Marcus felt his consciousness expand beyond the boundaries of his own mind. Suddenly, he was connected to Princess Lyrelei in a way that bypassed all physical senses and spoke directly to the core of who they were as individuals. What he found there shocked him to his foundations. Princess Lyrelei's mind was not weak or submissive as she had pretended. It was a fortress of disciplined intelligence, with defenses and capabilities that made even the psychic judges seem crude by comparison. She had spent years not just hiding her true abilities, but actively developing them in secret, creating psychic techniques that were unknown to imperial science. More importantly, she shared his core values in ways that ran deeper than species or culture. She valued individual freedom, despised the oppression that held the Empire together, and had been planning for years to find a way to challenge the system from within. She had chosen to accept his bond claim not because she was submissive, but because she recognized him as the catalyst she needed to begin a revolution. But the real revelation came when she began to share her memories of life in the imperial court. Marcus saw through her eyes the casual cruelty with which the Empire treated not just humans, but any species deemed inferior. He witnessed the systematic oppression, the calculated humiliation, and the way that the Empire's strength came not from unity, but from the grinding domination of the weak by the strong. And he saw her plans. Detailed, comprehensive strategies for undermining the Empire's power structure from within, using the legal protections of royal status and the strategic advantages of being consistently underestimated. She had been preparing for decades to find the right moment and the right ally to begin a careful campaign of liberation. The psychic judges were examining their connection, looking for signs of incompatibility or hidden agendas that would justify dissolving the bond claim. What they found instead was something that stunned them into silence. Marcus and Lyrale were not just compatible. They were complementary in ways that created something greater than the sum of their parts. His tactical brilliance and her strategic planning capabilities merged into a unified approach to problem-solving that neither could achieve alone. His warrior's courage gave strength to her careful intelligence, while her deep understanding of imperial politics provided the framework for his instinctive rebelliousness. "Impossible," whispered one of the judges. "Their mental patterns are synchronizing in real time. This level of spiritual compatibility is unheard of between different species." But there was more. As their minds merged more completely, Marcus and Lyrale began to share not just thoughts and plans, but fundamental aspects of their personalities. She gained access to his military training and tactical instincts, while he absorbed her deep understanding of psychic manipulation and imperial law. When the trial finally ended, and their minds separated back into individual consciousness, both of them had been fundamentally changed. They were still themselves, but each now carried aspects of the other that would shape their thinking for the rest of their lives. The psychic judges conferred in hushed tones before rendering their verdict. "The spiritual bonding has revealed perfect compatibility," announced the high psychic judge. "These two individuals are not merely suitable for bond mating, they appear to have been destined for it across species lines. We have never witnessed such deep spiritual resonance." Emperor Vorthak rose from his throne, his massive form trembling with barely controlled rage. All three trials had been passed, and by the ancient laws of the Empire, the bond claim was now legally valid. Marcus Chen, human slave turned gladiatorial champion, was now the bonded mate of Princess Lyrale of House Nethes, with all the legal protections and political privileges that entailed. But as the crowd began to disperse and the formal bonding ceremony was scheduled, none of them realized what had truly happened in that psychic linking. The Empire had just witnessed the birth of something unprecedented in galactic history, a human-alien partnership that combined the best capabilities of both species into a single, unified force for change. And as Marcus and Lyrale exchanged the ritual words that would legally bind them together, both of them knew that they had just taken the first step in a plan that would either free every oppressed species in the Empire or see them both die in the attempt. The overlooked alien princess and the human warrior had found each other across the vast differences of species and culture. Now, the real work could begin. 6 months after the bonding ceremony, the Vorthak Empire was beginning to understand that it had made a catastrophic error in allowing a human warrior to bond with royal blood. What had been intended as a humiliating spectacle that would reinforce species hierarchy had instead created something the Empire had never faced before, an internal threat that operated entirely within the bounds of imperial law. Princess Lyrale and her human bondmate had taken residence in the Nethesian royal quarter of the capital, and from their modest palace, they had begun to quietly reshape the political landscape of the galaxy. Their methods were subtle, legal, and absolutely devastating to the established order. It started with the humans. As the bonded mate of royalty, Marcus now held noble rank within the imperial hierarchy, which gave him certain legal rights that no one had anticipated. He immediately began filing formal petitions for the review of human slave classifications, citing obscure legal precedents, and challenging the scientific basis for humanity's designation as an inferior species. Each petition was carefully crafted by Lyrale's superior understanding of imperial law and supported by Marcus's first-hand combat experience and tactical innovations. They couldn't be dismissed as the ravings of an inferior species because they came from a recognized noble who had proven his worth in ritual combat. The imperial bureaucracy was forced to respond to each petition with formal legal proceedings. But the real genius lay in what happened during those proceedings. Lyreley had discovered that imperial law required all legal testimony to be given under psychic examination to ensure truthfulness. As a powerful psychic herself, she was able to subtly influence the proceedings to ensure that the full truth about human capabilities would be revealed. When Marcus testified about human military tactics, the psychic judges couldn't ignore the sophisticated strategic thinking involved. When he demonstrated human adaptability by learning alien combat techniques and improving upon them, the established scientific classifications began to crumble. More importantly, other humans throughout the Empire began to hear about the proceedings through official news channels. For the first time since the conquest, they began to understand that resistance was possible and that someone was fighting for them from within the system itself. The response was immediate and dramatic. Across the Empire, human slaves began to demonstrate capabilities that their overseers had never suspected. Work efficiency improved dramatically as humans stopped deliberately sabotaging their output. Escape attempts decreased, but the quality of human work in technical fields suddenly rivaled that of supposedly superior species. Emperor Vorthak quickly realized that his human slave population was becoming restless, but every attempt to suppress the legal proceedings was blocked by the very laws that held his empire together. Lyreley had chosen her battles carefully, ensuring that each case she brought forward was unassailable under imperial legal precedent. But the human classification challenge was only the beginning. Marcus and Lyreley had identified a fundamental weakness in the empire's structure. The Vorthak system depended on the assumption that conquered species would remain conquered, accepting their inferior status and working within the limitations imposed upon them. The entire imperial hierarchy was built on the premise that some species were naturally suited to rule, while others were naturally suited to serve. By proving that this premise was false for humans, they had opened the door to questioning it for every other supposedly inferior species in the empire. Their next target was the Kelhari, an aquatic species that had been classified as suitable only for manual labor in the Empire's underwater mining operations. Lyreley's research had revealed that Kelhari society had possessed sophisticated mathematical and engineering knowledge before their conquest, but this had been ignored because their technology was biologically integrated and appeared primitive to surface-dwelling species. Using her legal status as royalty, Lyreley requested a formal cultural review of the Kelhari, citing the recent revelations about human capabilities as grounds for re-examining the classification of other species. The request couldn't be denied without admitting that the Empire's classification system was fundamentally flawed. Marcus, meanwhile, used his military background to demonstrate that Kelhari individuals, when properly motivated and equipped, could adapt to combat roles with startling effectiveness. Their natural underwater mobility and ability to operate in hostile environments made them formidable special operations troops when given appropriate training and equipment. The review proceedings revealed that the Kelhari had been systematically prevented from demonstrating their true capabilities by being confined to aquatic environments and given only the most basic tools. When allowed access to advanced technology and proper education, they proved to be exceptionally gifted engineers whose understanding of fluid dynamics and pressure systems far exceeded that of any surface species. The Emperor watched with growing alarm as the Kelhari classification was officially revised, granting them higher status within the imperial hierarchy and opening up new career opportunities throughout the empire. But more dangerous than the immediate political implications was the precedent being established. If humans and Kelhari had been misclassified, what about the dozens of other supposedly inferior species? The psychological impact on the empire's ruling classes was immediate and devastating. Species that had believed themselves naturally superior began to question their own assumptions. Military commanders found themselves wondering if their supposedly primitive enemies might possess capabilities they had never recognized. Scientists began to re-examine decades of research that had been built on the assumption of species hierarchy. But Marcus and Lyreley weren't finished. Their next move would shake the empire to its very foundations. They turned their attention to the Vorthak themselves. Using Lyreley's access to royal archives and Marcus's outsider perspective, they began a careful analysis of Vorthak history and culture. What they discovered was that the Emperor's own species had not always been the undisputed masters of their empire. Millennia ago, The Vorthak had been just one species among many in a collaborative galactic federation. Their rise to dominance had come not through natural superiority, but through a carefully orchestrated campaign of political manipulation and technological theft. The evidence was all there in the historical records, hidden in plain sight because no one had ever thought to look for it. The advanced technology that gave the Vorthak their military superiority had been stolen from conquered species and claimed as Vorthak innovations. The philosophical and legal frameworks that justified their rule had been adapted from the traditions of peoples they had destroyed. Even more damning, the evidence showed that the Vorthak's own original culture had been remarkably similar to human civilization, emphasizing individual achievement, democratic decision-making, and cooperation between equals. The current imperial system was not a natural expression of Vorthak nature, but a corruption that had developed over centuries of conquest and oppression. Lyrale presented this evidence in a formal academic paper that she submitted to the imperial university system under her royal prerogatives. As a princess, her research could not be suppressed without cause, and the evidence she presented was too well documented to be dismissed as fabrication. The paper spread through academic circles like wildfire, sparking debates that quickly spilled over into popular consciousness. Young Vorthak citizens began to question the justifications they had been given for their species' dominance. Scholars from subject species found themselves vindicated in theories they had never dared to express openly. But the most explosive revelation came when Marcus used his military expertise to analyze the tactical records of the Vorthak conquest campaigns. He demonstrated that in every case, Vorthak victory had depended not on superior fighting ability, but on superior numbers and stolen technology. When facing enemies on equal terms, Vorthak forces had consistently performed poorly compared to supposedly inferior species. The Emperor's response was swift and desperate. He declared martial law and attempted to suppress all discussion of the research findings. But it was too late. The information had already spread too widely, and the legal precedents that Marcus and Lyrale had established made it impossible to silence them without destroying the legal framework that held the Empire together. More importantly, their campaign had achieved its ultimate goal. Across the Empire, subject species were beginning to recognize their own worth and demand better treatment. The careful balance of fear and resignation that had kept the Empire stable for millennia was rapidly breaking down. The crisis came to a head when the Kelhari workers in the underwater mining facilities declared a general strike, demanding equal rights and representation in imperial government. They were quickly joined by human technical specialists, Quellian researchers, and representatives of dozens of other supposedly inferior species. Emperor Vorthak faced an impossible choice. He could attempt to crush the uprising with military force, but this would require him to acknowledge that his rule depended on violence rather than natural authority. Alternatively, he could negotiate with the rebels, but this would mean accepting the fundamental challenge to species hierarchy that Marcus and Lyrale had created. The Emperor chose violence, ordering his military forces to suppress the strikes and arrest the rebel leaders. But when his commanders attempted to carry out these orders, they discovered something that shocked them to their core. The Empire's military effectiveness had been built on the assumption that subject species would not resist with full commitment. Now, facing opponents who were fighting for their freedom rather than merely following orders, Vorthak forces found themselves outmatched at every turn. Human technical specialists had sabotaged critical military systems. Kelhari engineers had flooded key installations. Quellian researchers had turned their knowledge of alien psychology against their former masters. Species that had been classified as primitive demonstrated tactical innovations that Vorthak military doctrine had no answer for. Within weeks, the Empire's military structure was in complete collapse, not because the rebels had superior weapons or numbers, but because they possessed something the Vorthak had forgotten how to fight against: the desperate creativity of people fighting for their freedom. Emperor Vorthak's final attempt to maintain control came in the form of a direct challenge to Marcus. If the human warrior was truly responsible for the rebellion, then let him face the Emperor in single combat to determine the fate of the Empire. It was an attempt to reduce the complex political revolution back to simple physical dominance. Marcus accepted the challenge, but with conditions that Lyrale had carefully crafted. The combat would be conducted under ancient ritual law, with the winner gaining not just victory, but the legal right to restructure the empire according to their vision. The final battle took place in the same arena where Marcus had first claimed Princess Lyrale as his reward. But this time, the audience was different. Representatives of every species in the empire watched as the human warrior faced the emperor who had oppressed them all. The fight itself was surprisingly brief. Emperor Vorthak was larger, stronger, and more heavily armored than Marcus. But the human warrior had learned something during his months of political maneuvering with Lyrale. Sometimes the most effective strategy is to let your enemy defeat themselves. Marcus fought defensively, using the emperor's size and aggression against him. He demonstrated every human tactical innovation that had been revealed during the legal proceedings. Every adaptation that proved human intelligence was equal to any species in the galaxy. And as the fight progressed, it became clear to everyone watching that the Emperor was not winning because of superior ability, but simply because of physical advantages that had nothing to do with fitness to rule. When Marcus finally struck the decisive blow, it came not through superior strength, but through tactical brilliance and perfect timing. The Emperor fell, and with him, the entire ideological foundation of species hierarchy collapsed. But Marcus did not claim the Emperor's throne. Instead, he and Lyrale announced the establishment of a new governmental system, a galactic federation where every species would have representation based on population and contribution rather than supposed natural hierarchy. The Vorthak Empire was dead. In its place rose the Galactic Federation, with Marcus Chen and Princess Lyrale serving as its first co-presidents, elected by representatives of all member species. Years later, historians would debate whether the transformation had been inevitable or if it depended entirely on the specific combination of Marcus's tactical genius and Lyrale's strategic brilliance. What was undeniable was that the human warrior's choice of the overlooked alien princess as his reward had changed the course of galactic history. Humanity took its place as an equal partner in galactic civilization, no longer the conquered slave species, but respected members of a diverse community of equals. The other formerly oppressed species experienced similar transformations, discovering capabilities they had never been allowed to develop under imperial rule. But perhaps the most profound change was in the Vorthak themselves. Freed from the burden of maintaining their artificial superiority, many of them rediscovered the collaborative values that had defined their species before the imperial period. They became enthusiastic supporters of the Federation system, grateful to be released from the impossible task of ruling over peoples they had never truly understood. The arena where it all began was eventually converted into a memorial celebrating the diversity and potential of intelligent life throughout the galaxy. At its center stood a simple plaque commemorating the moment when a human warrior chose an overlooked alien princess and inadvertently sparked a revolution that freed billions of beings from the chains of assumed inferiority. Marcus and Lyrale's bond mating had been intended as a cruel joke by an emperor who thought he understood the nature of power and dominance. Instead, it became the foundation of a new form of civilization, based on the radical idea that intelligence, courage, and wisdom could arise in any species, and that the galaxy was strongest when all its peoples were free to contribute their unique capabilities to the common good. The human warrior had indeed chosen the most overlooked alien princess as his reward. But in the end, the galaxy itself had been the ultimate prize.